Okay, so we talked about the overall portfolio and how there's two parts, the sustained investigation part and then the selected works. And we looked at a lot of examples of sustained investigation. And now we're going to go ahead and look at selective works to make sure you have a better understanding of that. So to review, the selected work section, those are 5 physical pieces. They can also be high quality digital prints that are mailed to the College Board. So these are pieces that you actually submit the piece. The rest of your work is submitted digitally via the computer. Your physical pieces, so your selected works that you send in, cannot be any larger than 18 by 24, and that's just really because of how you are mailing it. They also can be works pulled from your sustained investigation, or they can be totally separate. I recommend that they are the same for the most part. This is something that we will talk about and determine throughout the course as you're working on things. So we are going to look at these examples and then talk about the scoring. So some things to look at here is the writing that you'll see at the bottom of each one of these images. And this is something that you will have to do and that we will practice as you submit your work. So you have to write about, for each one, ideas, materials, and process, and remembering that you can only use 100 characters. So here for the ideas, they've told us, starting with constructivism and Tightland's tower symbolic of community, reconstruct architecture into new utopia. So one thing I want you to see from that, because there is such a limited amount of characters you can use, you can kind of shorten things. They also do like using plus instead of the word and. You could take with, and instead of writing without, you could shorten with the W and backslash. That is something we'll work on together. Materials, ink, graphite, and watercolor. So as we're looking at this, one thing I want you to really pay attention to is the list of materials. So if there's a piece that you see and you're like, that is really interesting, I love how it looks, make note of the materials, especially if they're materials that you have never used before. And then I'm going to have you post in our Google Classroom, and some of you may have a long list, some of you may not have a list at all. That's fine, you're not getting a grade for it. This is just to help me help you. So for example, if you were reading this and were like, this piece is really, really cool. I have never worked with ink before, but based on what I see here, I think I might like to work with ink. So you would post that in Google Classroom as questions about working with ink. The process that they used, illustrate a more physical representation of the idea. Okay, so this one we're looking at a little bit differently than the last one. I'm going to go back and forth of looking at an image, remembering all 5 of these pieces come together, and then filtering the commentary in. So this one scored a 4. For your selected works, it is scored on a range of 1 to 6, but 5 is the highest score that you would actually see. So a 5 is a very good score. So here is the commentary. So the first part that you're scored on are drawing skills. You're going to see this is similar to how you are scored on the selected works. There are just a few less categories. So drawing skills. There is substantial evidence of advanced drawing skills in this abstract architectural portfolio. In all of the images, there is careful and sophisticated layering of the elements of design to create experiences that seem to be occupiable space, but remain impossible to construct, and yet ultimately function as conceptual compositions. The use of graceful curves and dynamic angles are combined with a range of textures, values, and colors to develop compelling imagery. Compositionally, the works include complex means of creating balance, emphasis, and rhythm within the style of the architectural renderings. So this is a second one from the same portfolio, so you can see the connection. While all of these pieces that we're going to look at are connected, your selected works don't need to all be connected to each other. So the ideas for this one, architecture as a reflection of political instability and changing nature of the Soviet state. So what you're putting in the ideas section is really, what were you thinking about? What inspired you to make the thing that you made? What made you want to draw what you drew? Materials, graphite on marker board, Process. Include architectural elements such as beams and staircases, and drawings including plans and elevations. So one thing that's interesting from the first piece to the second piece is the composition. So the first piece we see is very vertical. This is kind of a rather typical proportion. And then here they switch and they have this really long, thin horizontal piece. So that in of itself is showing a different type of composition and a different way of having to deal with what you're putting on the paper and how it looks. So that's just one idea. There are lots of ideas that we'll talk about. One idea is just what is the size of the paper or canvas that you're working on. So here is feedback on the materials, processes, and ideas section. Visual relationships among materials, processes, and ideas are clearly evident and demonstrate synthesis. So just like when we're looking at sustained investigation, the materials that you choose, the processes that you select need to connect with the idea that you're talking about of how do they actually work together. The student masters carefully drafted shapes, gestural mark making, and application of painted surfaces to reference brutalist and constructivism movements of art and design, both rooted in 20th century political history. Beginning with a drawing in work 1 that is inspired by Vladimir Tautlin's tower, the student uses similar helix shapes and lines that plunge the viewer upward in space. Works 2 to 5 show a refined understanding of drafted architectural plans and elevations. However, the student manipulates the techniques to create drawings reminiscent of constructivist and brutalist buildings. The variety of materials used and processes applied create dramatic, sometimes chaotic imagery that allude to different periods in Russian and Soviet history. Synthesis occurs as the student uses architectural elements that are in juxtaposition or placed impractically, thus creating energetic compositions that are intended to clearly be more conceptual than practical plans for construction. So here is another example. We're seeing, so the format is another kind of more horizontal one. It's not quite as long and narrow as the last one that we looked at. We're seeing a lot of interesting depth created by this spiraling, and also an interesting compositional element is that each one of these spirals feed into each other, creating almost a figure 8 that just creates a lot of movement and keeps the eye going throughout the piece. So we're looking in this way, but we're also kind of diving down into it. So that's a great compositional example when you can have the viewer kind of push their looking in several different directions. So the ideas for this one: reconstruct the brutalist architecture into a new utopia that is far from ideal. It is dark and dramatic. So we can see, one, their idea is really showing up here. Materials used: acrylic and ink. Process: include architectural elements such as beams and staircases, and drawings including plans and elevations. So here's some information. This is the scoring feedback about the student's writing. And when they're talking about the writing, they're talking about these little descriptions that we just looked at under each image. Written evidence thoughtfully identifies materials, processes, and ideas. So thoughtfully is meaning what they have written makes a lot of sense. It clearly connects to what we're seeing when we look at the work of art. The student consciously explains that they are using architecture as a reflection of political instability and changing nature of the Soviet state. References to constructivism, brutalism, communism, and the Soviet state outline a theoretical framework of ideas that are then executed using architectural elements such as beams and staircases, and drawings including plans and elevations. The concluding piece describes that the variation of materials is representative of strategies attempted to build perfect future after Soviet reconstruction. The materials listed for each piece are clear and concise, comprising ink, graphite, watercolor, and acrylic. The student changes the material and/or technique with each image to create a range of order or disorder dependent on the idea expressed. So they're saying the student really was using materials and techniques to portray the idea that they said they wanted to express. In work 5, which we'll see in a moment, they also list glass as a material, so the viewer understands that the media choice and multi-layered process symbolizes transparency of reconstruction. So let's look at that piece. So this piece, the ideas: manipulate communism, a period of Russian history to create something different, yet same, desire for perfection. Again, taking note of, because you have such a limited amount of characters, this doesn't have to be perfect sentence structure. It's putting the words together to describe what we're seeing. Materials are acrylic and ink. Oh, and I'm sorry, this is image 4. We'll see image 5 in just a moment. The process: architectural elements such as beams and staircases, and drawings including plans, elevations. I create an experience. All right, here is image 5. So ideas: the transparency during the Soviet reconstruction process. Materials: glass, acrylic, ink. Process: variation of materials representative of strategies attempted to build perfect future after Soviet reconstruction. So part of the reason it's important to list your materials is because, especially when we're looking at these, them digitally, it's hard to actually see the materials. That is also part of the reason that they have you send these 5 selected works in, so they can really see, what do your things look like in person? Do they have texture? What do your marks really look like? Giving a stronger story to tell about your pieces. So let's look at another example. So here is our first piece, ideas. I focused on the beliefs that were part of my upbringing through the symbolic use of flowers. Materials: oil painting and unstretched canvas. Process: painting. Second example. So you'll see in these, they still feel connected. I think some of them aren't quite as connected as that last one, which again is fine. The things in your selected works do not all have to be connected. Ideas: I focused on the beliefs that were part of my upbringing through symbolic use of flowers. So you can see the student their idea is the same. And that can be fine. My guess is that they were actually pulling these from their sustained investigation part, and that this was their sustained investigation. Materials: colored pencil and acrylic, and the process was drawing and painting. So this is another example of a section of selected works that scored a 5, and let's look at why. So looking at drawing skills, this body of work provides evidence of advanced drawing skills through a variety of traditional media. With the use of strong compositions, the student constructs a narrative within each piece, exploring contrast through the use of color, which we see in works 1, 2, and 5, figure-ground relationships, which we see in work 3, and perspective, which we see in work 4. Using the motif of the flower, the works show a variety of approaches. So meaning they use the flower consistently throughout their pieces, which we're going to see, but they did it in different ways. Work 1 displays the flower prominently, whereas in work 4, the flower is intentionally used as part of the conversation in the work, but not the focal point. The body of work exhibits a strong use of chiaroscuro and reminiscent of a Baroque style. Each piece is gracefully executed with advanced skills using oil, acrylic, and colored pencil. So here's another example. We're also seeing different types of compositions. So this first one is a really close up and almost becomes kind of abstract. We are looking down at the figure because we see, oh, that's actually a book. At first I thought that was legs. And this was a skirt, but it's not, which is what I'm saying when it's a little bit abstract because of how close we are. So we have a book, this looks like a fabric, the hand coming in, but we're getting some different perspectives because we're looking straight down at the book, but it kind of looks like we are in front of the flower. So that's an interesting way to deal with composition. Here, we are more looking straight into the figure and the flowers, but all of the black behind creates a lot of depth. Like this space could go on forever and ever. Here, they're filling up the whole picture plane, but again, we're getting a lot of depth by having these flowers up in the foreground, really detailed, and things fading off into the back. Also, some dramatic lighting on the figure. So the ideas are the same as the other ones. Materials: colored pencil on black matte board. and process drawing. Another thing for you to continue to think about as we look at these is even how does the material and what you put the material on change. So we've looked at pieces in the past where students worked on cardboard. We heard one of the students talk about working on marker board and now working on black mat board. So also changing what is the color of the surface you're working on and how does that impact your work. So as you can see, they are keeping the idea the same. Materials here, oil paint, mat board, and acrylic. Through painting, we are once again, the flowers are still here, but they are continuing to be shown to us in different ways and the composition is changing. Now the viewer is kind of off in this corner. We're kind of behind this person because we're being slightly blocked by them and then getting to look in through here. So here is feedback on how they use materials, processes, and ideas. The visual relationships among materials, processes, and ideas are clearly evident and demonstrate synthesis. Though not required in selected works, the visual relationship among works are undoubtedly visible. Synthesis of materials, processes, and ideas is furthered as flowers are explored as symbols of religion and metaphorically considered within a cultural context. Ideas are furthered by the carefully chosen flowers to extend meaning. In work 1, the student uses a lily, a symbol of Easter, newness of life and resurrection, and it is placed next to a book, presumably a Bible. In work 3, poppies are drawn, which have long been used as a symbol of sleep, peace, and death. And here is our last example, where now the flowers are really becoming like a whole part of what the person is actually wearing. This is an oil painting. And feedback on the writing. Written evidence outlines the materials, processes, and ideas relevant to each work. The student clearly identifies the concepts used in creating each piece, and the relationship between text and image is closely tied together. It might have been useful to have statements about ideas that are specific to each work. Instead, the student has repeated the same statement for all 5 examples. So I did want you to make note of that. So the student didn't lose points for that. They still received a 5, but that's not a necessarily recommended technique. So I'm going to be working with you and pushing you when we develop the writing around these pieces to think about the specific idea that you were working on for each image. So you may have had this broader idea like this student. They were focusing on the beliefs that were part of their upbringing through symbolic use of flowers, but getting a little bit more specific for each image. So the student maybe could have talked about in each image why they selected the flower that they selected. Something like that, assuming that maybe not all of us know the symbolic nature of different kinds of flowers would be an example. This intent is evident in each of the works, but more specifically in differentiating the intent between each one might have been useful to both the student and the viewer.